In the heart of Seoul's bustling nightlife district, what began as a festive Halloween celebration, it turned into one of history's deadliest crowd disasters. Tonight's true crime horror story reveals the chilling sequence of events that led to 159 deaths in a single alleyway. Through survivor accounts and haunting details, we explore how a perfect storm of negligence and chaos created an inescapable nightmare. Join us for this dark screen ASMR documentary as we uncover the tragedy that forever changed South Korea's Halloween celebrations. Warning: contains disturbing content. Let me tell you about the night that changed Seoul forever. I was there in the aftermath, working as a first responder, and what I witnessed, well, some things you can't unsee. The story begins with a pink cloth placed gently in an alleyway, a memorial that would come to represent so much more. But to understand the weight of that simple piece of fabric, we need to go back to October 29th, 2022, when Itaewon was alive with anticipation. Picture this: a crisp autumn evening in Seoul's most vibrant district. The air tingled with excitement as young people emerged from subway stations like colorful butterflies, their Halloween costumes catching the neon lights. After 3 years of pandemic restrictions, the city was finally ready to celebrate again. You know how cities have a pulse? That night, Itaewon was racing. The narrow streets filled with the scent of street food and the warmth of soju. But there was something else in the air. Something that made the hairs on the back of your neck stand up if you paid attention. I remember checking my phone that evening, 6:30 p.m. The first emergency call had already come in, though none of us knew its significance then. A concerned citizen reporting dangerous crowding near Hamilton Hotel. It would be the first of many ignored warnings. Let me tell you about Minji. She was 23, dressed as Princess Jasmine that night. At 9:35 p.m., she sent her last selfie to her parents. Bright smile, eyes sparkling with life. "Going to have the best Halloween ever," she texted. Her father would later find that message while identifying her body. The alleyway that would become their tomb was deceptively simple. Just 10 feet wide, 130 feet long, sloping downward like a funnel. During the day, it was nothing special. But that night, it became something else entirely. Something hungry. What most people don't know is that earlier that day, city officials had met to discuss crowd control. They predicted 100,000 visitors. They planned for far fewer. In their offices, they shuffled papers and made decisions that would haunt them forever. As darkness fell, the crowd grew denser. The music got louder. The air got thicker. And in that infamous alleyway, physics was about to teach us all a terrible lesson about the power of human bodies in motion. But before I tell you what happened next, you need to understand something. This isn't just a story about numbers. It's about dreams that ended too soon. About parents who kissed their children goodbye, never knowing it would be the last time. About a night that started with costumes and laughter and ended with pink memorial clothes dancing in the autumn wind. And the most terrifying part, the real horror wasn't in the supernatural or the unknown. It was in the simple, devastating arithmetic of too many bodies in too small a space, and the sound of thousands of unanswered phone calls echoing through the night. The clock struck 9 p.m., and that's when things started shifting. You see, in crowd disasters, there's always a tipping point, a moment when celebration transforms into catastrophe. In Itaewon, It happened gradually, then all at once. Remember that alleyway I mentioned? Picture yourself there. The brick walls rise 3 stories high on either side, creating a concrete canyon. The ground beneath your feet isn't flat. It's an uneven slope with ancient paving stones that have been worn smooth by millions of footsteps. Above, strings of Halloween decorations sway between buildings, creating strange, shifting shadows. By 9:30 p.m., the crowd had become a living thing. Those who were there described it as an ocean. Waves of people moving without direction or control. The air grew thick with body heat, the scent of perfume mixing with sweat and fear. Some people's feet weren't even touching the ground anymore. A survivor, let's call her Jinnah, later told me something that still haunts me. She said the pressure came in waves. Each time it hit, you could feel your lungs struggling to expand. It was like being slowly crushed by a python made of human bodies. At 9:47 p.m., all cell phone signals in the area were overwhelmed. Imagine that. Hundreds of people trying to call for help, but their voices couldn't reach beyond those brick walls. The last messages sent from that alleyway tell their own horror story. "Mom, I can't breathe. Please help. I love you." The most chilling part? While some people were already fighting for their lives in the crush, others just 50 feet away were still partying, completely unaware. The music from the clubs created a soundtrack of oblivious joy, while tragedy unfolded in slow motion. By 10:15 p.m., the pressure had become unbearable. The crowd was now so dense that people were being lifted off their feet, their arms pinned to their sides. Those who were shorter found themselves at chest level, gasping for air that wasn't there. The heat from thousands of bodies had turned the alleyway into a furnace. And here's something that still keeps me up at night. The dominoes. One person falls, and in a crowd that dense, they can't get up. Others fall on top of them. The human chain reaction begins. In that alleyway, people started stacking like cards, reaching heights of 13 feet. Think about that. A wall of human bodies, 5 or 6 people deep. Remember Minji, the girl dressed as Princess Jasmine? She was somewhere in the middle of that crush. Her last phone call was at 10:23 p.m. "I can't move," she told her friend. "People keep pushing. I can't." The call was cut off mid-sentence. The most terrifying aspect wasn't the chaos. It was the mathematics of it all. Each person in that crowd was experiencing up to 1,000 pounds of force from all directions. No amount of physical strength could fight against those physics. The human body simply wasn't designed to withstand such pressure. By 10:30 p.m., screams had replaced laughter. The Halloween music still playing from nearby clubs created a surreal backdrop to the unfolding tragedy. And somewhere in that writhing mass of humanity, 159 stories were about to end. But what happened next? Well, that's the part that shows you just how thin the line is between civilization and chaos, and how sometimes the real monsters aren't the ones wearing Halloween masks. The true horror of what happened between 10:30 p.m. and midnight isn't in the numbers. Though 159 dead is horrific enough. No, the real nightmare lives in the details, in the small moments that rippled out into tragedy. Let me tell you about the denim jacket hero. He was just a regular guy, probably around 25, who found himself pinned against the alleyway wall. Instead of trying to save himself, He turned his body into a human ladder, letting others climb up over him to reach a small ledge above. They say he saved at least 10 lives before his own strength gave out. The physics of death in that alleyway were brutally simple. In a crowd crush, people don't actually die from being trampled. They die from asphyxiation while standing up. The pressure becomes so intense that your chest can't expand to breathe. They call it compressive asphyxia. It's like drowning in air. By 10:45 p.m., the scene had become apocalyptic. The neon lights from nearby clubs cast an eerie glow over the mass of bodies, creating strange shadows that danced on the walls. A nurse from Pakistan who survived later told me something that still chills me. He said the crowd moved like water, but felt like concrete. People's faces started turning purple, then blue. He performed CPR on 15 different people that night. Saved some, lost others. The look in his eyes when he told me this story. That's something you don't forget. 11:02 p.m. That's when the first responders finally managed to start pulling people out. But here's the thing about crowd crushes. By the time you can reach the victims, it's often too late. We found people still standing, phones clutched in their hands. But they were already gone. Messages unsent on their screens. Calls unanswered. The alleyway had become a morgue. We laid bodies out on the street, covering them with whatever we could find. Some still wore their Halloween costumes, a cruel joke of fate. A ghost face mask here, a superhero cape there. All these young people who dressed up as characters who couldn't die, now lying motionless on cold pavement. Remember Minji? They found her still clutching her friend's hand. Both of them had died standing up, unable to move, unable to breathe, but unwilling to let go of each other, even in death. Her Princess Jasmine costume was torn in the crush, but her tiara somehow stayed perfectly in place. The most haunting part, the aftermath. Walking through that alleyway later, we found hundreds of shoes scattered everywhere. Single shoes, as if their owners had been raptured away. Phones still ringing with desperate parents trying to reach their children. The ground was wet with spilled drinks, tears, and other things I don't want to mention. And the smell. God, the smell. It's something you never forget. A mixture of perfume, sweat, fear, and death. The air was thick with it, clinging to your clothes, your skin, your memories. By midnight, the full scope of the tragedy was becoming clear. But what happened next? The cover-ups, the lies, the desperate attempts by officials to wash their hands of responsibility. That's when the true monstrosity of human nature revealed itself. You see, sometimes the real horror isn't in the event itself, but in how people respond to it. In how quickly they try to turn victims into statistics, tragedy into paperwork, and responsibility into blame. But before I tell you about that part, let me share something that still keeps me awake at night. In the days that followed, we found messages on some of the victims' phones sent in those final moments. One read simply, "Mom, I'm scared. If I don't make it out, I love you." Dawn broke over Itaewon like any other day, but the world had changed overnight. Picture this, an old man, his hands trembling, placing a small pink cloth in that murderous alleyway. Behind him, lost shoes, torn clothing, and broken phones created a trail of interrupted lives. The numbers came in waves. First 59 dead, then 120, finally 159. But numbers don't tell you about the father who kept performing CPR on his daughter for an hour after she was already gone. They don't tell you about the mother who found her son's last selfie. His smile frozen in time, taken just minutes before the crush. I need to tell you about the photographer from China. He survived that night, went back to his hotel room, and couldn't bring himself to tell his pregnant wife what he'd witnessed. 3 photos on his camera. That's all he took before everything went wrong. 3 photos of people laughing, celebrating, and alive. The business owners along that alleyway, they're haunted too. The owner of White Kiki Bar told me he can't sleep without sedatives anymore. There was a smell, he said. A distinct smell when the crowd started to crush. I'll never forget it. His hands shook as he poured soju. His eyes fixed on something I couldn't see. By mid-morning, the alleyway had become a memorial. People laid flowers where bodies had been. The contrast was striking. Bright bouquets against dark pavement, still stained with, well, let's just say the rain couldn't wash everything away. Remember the denim jacket hero? They found him later, still pressed against that wall. He'd saved others, but couldn't save himself. In his pocket was a ticket to a concert the following weekend, and a photo of his little sister. Sometimes the brightest light comes from the darkest moments. The aftermath brought something else too, a parade of officials, each trying to distance themselves from responsibility. The police chief took an hour-long drive instead of a 10-minute walk to the scene. The emergency services, who received dozens of warning calls but didn't respond. The city planners who knew the risks but did nothing. But here's what haunts me most: the personal belongings. They filled an entire gymnasium, 123 handbags, 258 pieces of clothing, 256 pairs of shoes. Each item is a story, a life, a future that would never be realized. Parents came to identify their children's possessions, their grief echoing off the walls. A mother found her daughter's handbag, still containing a lipstick bought that day. A shopping list for next week, plans that would never happen. She clutched it to her chest and wept, her tears falling on the plastic bag containing her daughter's last possessions. The survivors carry their own ghosts. The Pakistani nurse who performed CPR until his arms gave out. The college couple who was supposed to be married in May. The streamer who broadcast the tragedy live. His viewers watching helplessly as joy turned to horror. Itaewon changed after that night. The neon still burns, the music still plays, but there's a heaviness in the air. That alleyway, people avoid it now. Some say they hear things at night, echoes of screams, phantom phone rings. But I think what they're really hearing is the weight of all those unfinished stories. And somewhere in Seoul, a father still cooks seaweed soup every morning, setting an extra place at the table for a daughter who will never come home. Because sometimes the real horror isn't in the dying. It's in the living that comes after. The truth about tragedy is that it doesn't end when the bodies are buried. Sometimes the real horror show begins with the cover-ups, the lies, and the desperate scramble of those in power to wash blood from their hands. Let me tell you about the police chief's dinner. While young people were dying in that alleyway, he sat in a restaurant eating hong tang soup. When the urgent calls came in, he chose to drive for an hour rather than walk 10 minutes to the scene. His CCTV footage shows him strolling casually, hands clasped behind his back, while chaos reigned just streets away. The investigation revealed something even more chilling. 4,700 police officers were positioned near the presidential office that night, protecting against peaceful protesters. Only 137 were assigned to Itaewon, an area expecting 100,000 Halloween revelers. But here's where it gets darker. Remember those emergency calls? Police tried to destroy them. Dozens of desperate voices crying out for help, almost erased from history. But like all buried truths, they found their way to the surface. A mother showed me her daughter's last text messages. "Mom, it's too crowded. I'm scared." Then, "I can't breathe." Finally, "I love you." The timestamps show the messages were sent during those crucial minutes when the police chief was deciding whether to walk or drive. December 2022 brought another tragedy. A 16-year-old survivor, the only one left from his group of friends, took his own life in a motel bathroom. His suicide note read, "Please don't forget me." The horror of that night claimed its 160th victim. 23 people have been indicted so far. Half of them are police officers, but indictments don't bring back the dead. They don't erase the sound of phones ringing unanswered in that alleyway, or the sight of shoes scattered like fallen leaves. The business owners in Itaewon tell me the district has become a ghost town. The neon still burns, but the streets are empty. People say they can feel something there now. A heaviness in the air, a pressure on their chest. Like the crowd is still there, still pushing. But perhaps the most terrifying part of this story isn't what happened. It's what hasn't happened. The same narrow alleyways still exist in cities across the world. The same overcrowding, the same lack of planning, the same human arrogance that says, "It won't happen here." I go back sometimes, late at night when the streets are quiet. That old man still comes too, placing his pink cloth, lighting his candles. He's not praying for the dead anymore. He's praying for the living, for those of us who carry the weight of that night. You see, the real horror of Itaewon isn't just in the 159 lives lost. It's in knowing that somewhere, right now, another crowd is gathering, another alleyway is filling, and another group of officials is looking the other way. They've put up a memorial now where that alleyway meets the main street. But the true memorial exists in the nightmares of survivors, in the empty chairs at family dinners, in the phones still stored in evidence lockers, their last messages frozen in time. Remember Minji, dressed as Princess Jasmine? Her father still visits her grave every day. He brings seaweed soup, just like she asked in her last letter. "Cook for me until I'm 96, she wrote. He says he will. Some promises survive even death. Because in the end, the most horrifying stories aren't about monsters or ghosts. They're about us, our negligence, our indifference, our capacity to look away when we should be looking closer.